Hello and welcome to my first tutorial. My name is Rich and I'm going to be talking through one of my favorite areas of music technology, and that is MIDI. So first of all, we're going to be talking about MIDI events and MIDI parts and how we can go on to make music with those elements. We're then going to talk about software instruments and samplers, specifically talking about Kontakt. And then we're going to be looking at some of the instruments which are made for Kontakt by companies such as Spitfire Audio. We'll take a bit of a behind the scenes look into how those instruments actually work. And then finally, we'll go in a little more in depth into how Cubase deals with MIDI on two different kinds of tracks, because Cubase can deal with MIDI tracks and instrument tracks, and they have slightly different functions, and we're going to look into why. So thank you so much for joining me, and I hope you enjoy. We're going to talk about how these sort of things become audible music that we can listen to. So first of all, we're going to solo this track, which means this is the only track we can hit. Cool. So we have all of these blobs, and these blobs are referred to politely as being MIDI events. So we might know them as notes, but the technical term in Cubase is going to be a MIDI event. So notice that each event has got various different parameters such as pitch, so F3, that's the F above middle C. The length, this is bars, beats, subdivisions, which are essentially semiquaver lengths, and then ticks, which are a way of measuring the distance between semiquavers, and there are 120 ticks in a semiquaver. And so this is saying that we have a single note which is going to be lasting for a semiquaver. On F3, this is going to be on C4, so that's the C above middle C. And the velocity is essentially the force with which that note's going to be played. Velocities can go between 0 and 127 as our kind of range, but we're going to put it back to being the casual 78 that it is. Notice we also have a nice little graphical display showing that the velocities are actually decreasing as we're ascending. So it's just kind of getting a little quieter as well. There's some really wonderful ways that we can mess around with this as well. So this would be getting louder and getting a little bit tiresome on the old ears there. The last thing to explain is that these blocks, which contain all of these events, are called MIDI parts. So we have MIDI events, and those are found to be within a MIDI part. The MIDI regions are then routed by a MIDI track, of which there are two varieties. There are instrument tracks and there are MIDI tracks, helpfully. In this case, we're going to be talking about instrument tracks, and the instrument track routes the MIDI events into a software instrument. The software instrument we're going to be talking about quite a bit is Kontakt. Kontakt is a sampler instrument, which means that you can build your own instruments within Kontakt, built around audio samples of actually recorded instruments. And we're going to be talking about Spitfire Audio and their instruments. Spitfire Audio create absolutely incredible sounding pieces of software, typically built around Kontakt. And so if we look, we're currently using the oboes two, so that's two oboes being played. In the short staccato, notice there are lots of different kind of patches, so there's marcato and there's long notes, for example, but right now we're just going to be talking about the staccato. If we take a look actually inside of the instrument, what we can see, if we look at the mapping editor and the wave editor, and we make sure we have select zone via MIDI selected, is that the way that the instrument works is that we respond to various different note inputs, and then that tells the instrument, play the sample which is associated with C3, so that is middle C. Notice we're talking earlier about the fact that velocity goes between 0 and 127. So the way that better sounding sampler instruments tend to work is that instead of having one note which across the entire range, and then we just make that quieter or louder depending on how forcefully we play the note on our keyboard, what we tend to have is a quiet note recorded. Sorry, that didn't work like I think it is. A quiet note recorded. A mezzo piano note. This would be, and then mapped between velocities 44 and 81. Then the same note, but played slightly louder, mapped between 82 and 104. and then mapped even louder, so big forte between 105 and 127, like that. And so that just gives a little bit more realism. Then the Kontakt itself can say, okay, so we'll play the quiet note between, you know, sorry if we select it, so between the ranges of 1 to 43 being the sort of the volume that we will play that note. And then we can actually watch this in action as we play our MIDI events. It's really nice Kontakt actually leaving behind a few of the notes so we can see what's actually being played. So we see in this kind of mezzo piano-y sort of sample that that's the kind of thing we're touching. And if they're slightly louder, if we say raise the velocity a touch, then we get a much harsher sound because it's into that mezzo forte-ish kind of sample. So it can make a real difference just having those small little incremental distances. Notice when I was writing this, it was essentially writing this fifth and then copying it up an octave and then copying up an octave. But of course, our lovely oboe does not actually have this particular note, the kind of F, whatever it's called, no, C6, my apologies. So it doesn't actually have a C6, so we actually get some ghost notes which aren't actually played, so notice here. So yeah, so there'll be lots of those, but for the sake of what we were doing, it didn't actually matter at all. So, and that's kind of the background info into how sampler instruments work, and Kontakt is the main beast which supports these kind of instruments. So what we then have is the audio that we can hear, but the audio itself is fairly transient. The only way we can hear that is by playing the notes over and over again. And what's going on is that every time we're playing these notes, the computer has to sort of read what's going on, send it via the MIDI instrument track to the software instrument. The software instrument reads that and goes, okay, we'll play the following notes. So if you think of the computer as being a performer at this point in time, it is playing those notes over and over again. And so what you instead do, say for example, you're happy with that, you don't want to change it anymore, you can render it to being an audio track. So if we go to rendering, render selection, we're going to keep this one event. Remember we were saying that the entire sort of block was called a MIDI event. So we're going to render this as an audio event. I'm going to take a little short while to sort this out, and we're creating an audio track, and this is actually what we're hearing as a waveform. We can kind of just zoom in on the waveform. This isn't making it louder, this is just making it more visual, so we can see what's actually going on. Again, we'll solo this, which means it's the only thing which is being played. Cool, and we can see that our waveform has been created. And this is much, much easier for the computer to read, because essentially the computer now knows how it sounds. It doesn't have to keep interpreting the MIDI information. I'm going to get rid of this for right now, because luckily our CPU is powerful enough to deal with whatever we're going to throw at it today, he says, hopefully. We're going to quickly talk about something which is Cubase specific, so this isn't really the case in other kind of bits of, in other DAWs, digital audio workstations. We're currently using Cubase Pro 10, but this wouldn't be the case in, say, Logic or Pro Tools to my knowledge. This track hosts Kontakt. These MIDI tracks are sending their MIDI events into the instance of Kontakt, which is here. We're going to slightly skim over why there's 26 and all this kind of stuff. Basically, in the background of Cubase, we have all of the instruments which are being hosted across all of our instrument tracks, and it just happens that this instrument track, this instance of Kontakt, happens to be 26, and that's just the order that we made things. That's why that's called 26, but we can pretty much ignore that for right now. It also helpfully tells us what patch it is actually responding to, which is really quite useful when you're trying to tie things together. So why have we done this? So if we listen to all of this together, it sounds like this. Cool. So what we have is essentially a repeating passage, this kind of main phrase, and then we just got this little fill here to give a little more color toward the end of the opening 4 bars, and then we have this kind of secondary sort of figure, this sort of repeating figure here, which sounds like this. In fact, what's really cool is if we load up this, notice the velocity gradually increasing. So again, so that final bop is right on the cusp of that mezzo forte. We're sort of, referring to it as mezzo forte staccato, and notice they actually have also named it mezzo forte. So that shows how we can use multiple tracks and feed them all into a singular instance of Kontakt. Again, this is just to kind of reduce the CPU load. I think this is a very quick little introduction into some of the basic and then also some of the more advanced concepts of kind of MIDI routing. If there's anything else you'd particularly like me to talk about in this sort of world, then do let me know. Kontakt itself is an incredible beast. And the majority of my album is built around instances of Kontakt, and I believe the majority of of film scores, at least in their opening phases, are certainly built around Kontakt. Let me know if there's anything else that I can explain about how this sort of stuff works, and thank you very much for watching. Thank you. Just as a quick thing to show you, here are the 3 instances of Kontakt which are used for the very opening of the track Zephyr. And it's just fun to kind of see the samples sort of dance around, so come take a look.